Hey everyone, welcome to the Grad Coach Podcast. My name's Derek, and today I'm joined by Dr. Ethar, one of our trusty coaches. And we're going to be talking about 3 things that you should know before starting your PhD journey. If you're currently contemplating taking on a PhD, or even if you're in the early stages of a doctoral program, you'll definitely want to catch this one. Also, you'll probably want to grab a copy of our free dissertation and thesis template over on the Grad Coach blog. You can find the link to that in the description. So without further delay, let's get this party started. Ethar, welcome to the pod.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So let's jump into number 1, the first thing that you should know before starting your PhD. And that is that a PhD is not some unbridled journey of intellectual curiosity, but rather that it's professional academia. Dr. E, this sounds like a real party pooper. What's this all about? What do students need to know about?
It's a party pooper. And I'll be very, very straight up, very, very honest with this, very, very clear. This is not a party. You are not entering a fun environment. This is not purely for the sakes of your kind of intellectual entertainment and intellectual curiosity, as much as you might think it is, or as much as you want it to be. So as much as people may have told you, or one may believe, that as you make your way through the degrees and you passed your bachelor's and you moved on to your master's and you're now onto your PhD, and in theory, you should be in this space where it's pure intellectual curiosity and, you can enter into a free reign space where you can just develop your own ideas and find out what doesn't make sense. And all you're really pursuing is raw intellectual curiosity and raw interest in the subjects and so on and so forth. That is not what a PhD is, nor will it ever be, nor has it ever been, at least not in these institutions or in the formal institutions of PhDs. In principle, this is, as you mentioned at the outset, a professional academic license. That's really what this is. And ultimately, what you're trying to say is that, but in the acquisition of that license, you're giving yourself the permission to be able to publish knowledge more than anything else. So much as a driving license gives you the permission to be able to drive the car, and you have to be able to pass the test to be able to make sure you can do those things appropriately. An academic license, or in this case, a PhD, is exactly the same principle. You're acquiring the permission, as it were, from those who can give it out to then be able to publish knowledge, whether that's in the form of written topics or in the form of speeches that you give or whatever else it might happen to be. But when you're speaking with a degree of authority on a subject you are supposedly an expert in, this is the license that says that you can do so and that your words carry a certain degree of weight, at least in this field. So it's not just the pursuit of the kinds of things you wanted to learn about with free reign and open discussion and, platonic platforms of symposia, and you could just sit down and talk with the other academics and try and figure out deep, complex ideas. That is not what this is. Ultimately, it is a license. Ultimately, there is a process. Ultimately, this is something that's been done thousands and thousands of times over. There's a way to do it. There's a way to get to the end of it. And the key point here is, as disappointing as it may be, that okay, I don't get to have the kind of fun I thought I might be able to. Mind you, I don't know who thought we were going to have fun doing a PhD, but okay, maybe that's not the case. But what certainly is the case is, again, much as with the driving license, it's not the period of time that you're acquiring the license, it's what you can do with it after the fact. So now you can drive around and do as you wish, or now you've got your PhD, you can start publishing things, or although maybe that's a little complicated too, but nevertheless, it's certainly a much more professional process than we might otherwise think it is.
It's very much a romanticized idea in the minds of many students, is that they've got through the slug work of an undergrad, they've done their masters, and now the PhD is just really their time to shine and their time to take this thing that they're really passionate about, this thing that they're really interested in researching, and take that to the world and show the world that they are, the expert in this space. And while that is arguably sort of part of the process, it is still a process of accreditation. It is still very much a system that you need to work through. Now, I'll say that there's certainly a high degree of variance between different PhD programs. Some PhD programs are very structured, and there's extensive coursework and extensive sort of directed instruction in the early stages before they kind of let you loose on the topic, while others are less structured. But nevertheless, it is still a process, and you don't just have free reign. You don't just get to sit and pontificate and contemplate the meaning of life all day and write about it. It's very much a process with milestones, and you might not even have much influence over the part of the process that is more loose. In other words, students often think that, well, this is exactly the little niche that they want to research, and then they get a research supervisor assigned to them, or they get the one that they thought they wanted, and suddenly they realize, wait a minute, this isn't actually so much my project anymore, rather that I am just here to do the necessary work on this research project so as to demonstrate that I am worthy of this license that you speak of, Dr. E.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. That's really ultimately what it comes down to. And what this really means more than anything else is that the sooner the individual that we're talking about who's entering into the journey of completing their PhD abandons the thought or divests themselves from the thought of, as we said, this entry into the pantheon of academic giants, the sooner they abandon that dream, the sooner you abandon that romantic ideal of what it is you think you're trying to achieve, and the sooner you adjust to the notion that this is a professional license, that you are acquiring, as you said, accreditation, that there is a preset, prefabricated process to doing so and to arriving where you want to arrive. And the sooner you commit yourself to that thought and treat it accordingly, the easier you will find the process as you make your way. And strangely enough, the more open it becomes to the possibility of actually doing something that might end up coming close to those romantic ideals. I mean, listen, this is not to say that there's no reason why a person couldn't produce a piece of PhD work that isn't astounding. And this is not to say that, whatever PhD you produce or whatever thesis you end up writing or dissertation you end up writing is therefore meaningless because it's a license like all others. What I don't want to do is give the impression that, like any driving license, every single PhD thesis is exactly the same. That's certainly not the case. And it certainly is the case that in every single instance, you're expected to contribute to the field with something original, et cetera, et cetera. We've heard all of these things 1,000 times. And it's certainly true that a degree of passion, a degree of desire, a degree of willingness, a degree of hunger for the degree, finally, is necessary in order for you to complete it. And that's perfectly fine. And there's no reason to believe that whatever you produce after the fact isn't going to be something that's meaningful to the field or the peak of your academic performance up until now. I mean, ideally, it should be that. But only to say that if you set your expectations there, as opposed to setting your sights firmly on what's immediately in front of you, on the tasks that you have to complete, on the duties that are imposed upon you, on the responsibilities that you carry as a PhD student, and the assumptions that come with that, the sooner you can adjust yourself to those hard realities, the greater the likelihood is that you can actually produce something of significant value. It's that, really.
I guess as the quote by Thomas Edison goes, genius is 1% inspiration, which is that inspiration and that initial urge that gets you to sign up for the PhD program, and 99% perspiration. It's very much about following the process, pushing through. I think the analogy of a PhD being the marathon rather than the sprint is highly relevant. This is very much a process, and you need to just commit yourself to that process and put in the hours and really just follow the instructions that are provided by your institution. The fewer preconceptions you can approach this with, probably the better off you'll be. All right, so let's jump on to the next thing that you should know before starting your PhD. And that is that the degree you've chosen probably won't meet your expectations. Dr. E, it's sounding like a lot of doom and gloom. Do you have anything that you can shed light on here that will help us feel a little bit better about this?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, there's a couple of stories I can refer to from my own past experiences and from my own time doing my own PhD. And to be fair, other people I've worked with, other students, friends, and people who've been in my universities or otherwise who've got stories about how those things actually end up turning out quite well for you. But again, it's part and parcel of what we said a moment ago in terms of the expectations that one sets for their degree. And in this particular case, I don't mean specifically just the PhD or just the PhD overall, but I mean the specific degree that you're taking. So in my particular case, I happen to do a PhD in philosophy, and whatever you're doing, yours in sociology or otherwise, it's not the point. But there are going to be specific details pursuant to your degree that make it better or worse, more or less challenging, more or less difficult. And the sooner you are familiar with those things, the sooner you understand exactly what's going to be required of you, not, again, just rose-tinted spectacle expectations of the kinds of things that you think you might want to do or the things that you might have the free reign to be able to do. The sooner you understand exactly what those challenges are, in fact, down to the finest details. So that would include things like trying to become familiar with the reading lists, if there are any reading lists, or the suggested reading, if there are going to be any suggested readings. If there are going to be assignments set in your particular PhD program, then it's worth trying to familiarize yourself with the kinds of assignments that you're going to be set. If you're going to be working with particular supervisors or particular committee members or particular chairs, it might even be helpful to find out as much as you possibly can about those individuals in terms of their previous experience guiding PhDs. In fact, it isn't necessarily a bad idea to get familiar with the people who are currently completing their PhDs in that program or have done so recently, and just to ask open-ended questions. I mean, what was it like? What was the experience? How difficult was it? How challenging was it? What were the particular nuances of that process that I might have to be aware of before I enter into it? And primarily so that you're not surprised at any given point, more than anything else. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is that taking on a PhD is no small thing, whether we're talking about the financial burden that comes with it or just the commitment to the workload that you're going to be taking on, the amount of reading you're going to be doing, the amount of writing you're going to be doing. There's nothing straightforward about this process, and it takes a degree of commitment to be able to say to oneself that they want to enter into that process in the first place. And I think it should be commended, generally speaking, as well. The degree itself, or the acquisition of the degree itself, should be commended. But the concern is that spirit, as you said a moment ago, that 1% of inspiration that gets you to the point of saying, okay, I think I'm going to take on a PhD, is a wonderful thing. But all too often it tends to collapse as soon as people start to realize the workload required or the particular nuances of what their PhD program is requiring from them. So the sooner a person can familiarize themselves with, as I said, the text that you think you might be having to read, or the people that you think you might be having to engage with, whether that's your committee members, supervisors, or etc., the better you can position yourself and prepare yourself for exactly what's coming up. And then the better you can set yourself up for success as you make your way through the degree.
I think from a practical perspective, ideally what I do is try to speak to people that have just gone through this process in your specific department or university, and get some insight to them as to what that process looks like, what it's like from a day-to-day basis, what were the ways in which their assumptions were inaccurate. You really want to be speaking to people that have gone through this process and gone through it recently, not someone who did it 10 years ago at a different university. How you get in touch with those people can be, I guess, a little bit challenging. Of course, you could just ask your university if there's any way they could put you in touch. But you'll very often find that something as simple as LinkedIn could be useful in this respect, because you can search for people based on their degree and the university that they did that degree in, and you should be able to connect with them. Generally, I think you will find that people are very, very forthcoming and very keen to talk about their experience. They went through the machine and generally will be quite keen to talk about it. So it's really, really useful to find those people that have gone through exactly what you're planning to or hoping to go through, so that you can just be as I guess, ready emotionally and intellectually as possible for this journey ahead.
Absolutely. And ideally, it would be great, be really, really helpful, right? Is if somebody had the foresight or the wherewithal to, I don't know, maybe set up let's call it like a company or a website that kind of harbored all of these ex-PhDs who kind of know what they're doing and understand these experiences and, hold it close to their chest, and are more than happy to pass on that knowledge and inform general people who are trying to acquire, if somebody had done that, I don't know, it's just weird. Do we know anything? Here, right here. Yeah, I feel like we do this, like it's here. So, look, jokes aside, if there was some kind of confusion or uncertainty about where a person could go for these things, it's certain, I don't mean to just advertise for the sake of advertising, but if we're going to do it, not going to do it here, where else are we going to do it? It seems, we certainly do this, and it's certainly the case. It's the kind of conversation that I encounter on a regular basis. So when we're talking to students at Grad Coach who either are thinking about signing up or have already signed up or have experienced some recent difficulties, and that's inspiring their decision to want to sign up, much of the early conversation is really breaking through that barrier of illusion or idealism, the uncertainty about what it is that they're facing and the confusion about what they've come across. Look, I'll give you a small, tiny little example from my own personal experience. So when I did my PhD, in philosophy, the assumption was that it was going to be, as I said, this kind of free floating open space. I mean, it's philosophy, right? Of all of the areas that I thought you might have free reign to kind of think about whatever it is that you want to think about and develop your thoughts in whatever direction you like. I figure philosophy would be about as loose restriction as you could possibly get. My word, was I wrong. Within the first 4 years, of course, this was a consequence of the supervisors that I was assigned, and this is a conversation that we can have in a moment, but within the first 4 years, the thing that astounded me was that I thought I was going to be writing a PhD on the problem of freedom, broad, open-ended, complex, philosophical, borderline spiritual thinking, and so on and so forth. I was reading all kinds of interesting texts. I even managed to squeeze some Buddhism in there. It was really, really interesting. And then before you know it, I'd spent 4 years chasing down the argument about whether or not my supervisor's dog could feel the kind of guilt that a human being could feel. I ended up reading all kinds of things about bonobo apes and their development of tools and how they hunt and catch other smaller apes, and whether or not dolphins are actually speaking a language, and whether or not whales have some kind of emotional communication when they're playing games. I mean, all of these things were so far removed from what I thought I was going to be doing. And the truth of the matter is that as much as I didn't enjoy it in the process, it certainly helped, at least to a degree. It certainly refined my thinking, at least to a degree. I mean, if nothing else, it makes for a really interesting anecdote. But if I had been aware of this beforehand, if somebody had told me ahead of time, hey, look, this philosophy PhD is not what you think it is. The conversations and the discussions you're going to be engaged in are not what you think they are. The kinds of requirements that you're going to have to meet are not what you think they are. It's not that kind of free land of just open thought, that there is a specific tradition. There's a specific way of thinking about the problem that you're particularly pursuing. In my case, it was the problem of freedom, but there's a tradition of doing this. There's a specific way to do this. And although I was familiar with that from my master's degree, the actual practice of doing it in the PhD was something I simply wasn't prepared for. And the consequence of that was that period of time, as successful as it ended up being, and as helpful as that period of time ended up being, and as much as I learned about dogs that I don't think I ever really need to know again, but as helpful as all of that was, the fact of the matter is that I certainly would have had a far, far easier time had I been prepared for that eventuality from the outset. If somebody made that clear to me, and perhaps it was my own arrogance, but if I had asked people, engaged in the conversation, as you said, possibly had the courage to go into LinkedIn, as you say, and look for people who have done this before and ask these questions, in all likelihood, I would have made a far, far clearer decision. I would have been far, far more prepared for what it was that I was going to encounter. And when those things came up, I would have been ready for them so that it doesn't perturb to the degree that it otherwise would. It doesn't create the anxiety, insecurity, discomfort, uncertainty that it otherwise ended up doing. And all of these emotional reactions to the position that you find yourself in are entirely unnecessary, particularly considering the scale of difficulty that you're already having to encounter. The amount of reading that you're doing, the amount of work you have to do, the standard set as high as it is for you to be able to pass this in the first place, with all of that in front of you and all of those burdens that you have to carry that one should be commended for trying to take on. With all of that, you don't need the additional emotional stress of, oh my God, is his dog guilty or not? Like, what do I do with this? Just don't need it.
I think all of us, or perhaps it's just me, but I think this is a general human tendency. We undertake these tasks, whether it's a PhD or anything else in life. And we, for some reason, think that, our journey is just 100% unique, and we just need to go and figure out everything on our own, and we just need to, fight the fight and get through all of this. When in fact, there are, in most cases, so many people that have done, if not your exact journey, a very, very similar journey in the past. And when it comes to a PhD, it's almost a certainty that someone else, or probably a handful or more of people, have done a PhD in the exact department that you're doing your PhD, and probably with the supervisor that you're going to have or have. And so you just really can I don't want to say take a shortcut, but you can just really increase your efficiency and optimize your whole approach by just having some basic conversations with these people beforehand, just getting some insight as to what might you expect. And that will just prepare you emotionally that when your supervisor does send you down a rabbit hole for 4 years thinking about the feelings of dogs, you somewhat ready for that. I don't know if you could ever be fully ready for that one. Great anecdote, by the way. But at least you understand that this is part of the process, and it's not this life-crushing event that you just think like, what am I doing? This is a complete waste of time. This isn't what I signed up for. So it can really increase your resilience by having some understanding of what are the hurdles that are going to be thrown at me from day one. All right, so on to our third and final item for this episode. And the third thing that you should definitely know before starting your PhD is that your relationship with your supervisor or advisor or chair, depending on what it's called, is way, way, way more important than you might think. Dr. E, why is this? What do students need to know?
Not too far removed from the points that we've already made in terms of making sure you understand exactly what a PhD requires of you, generally speaking, understanding also what your particular PhD program is going to require of you, a little more specifically speaking, and part of, as we said beforehand, getting to know the nuances of that, whether that's the reading list that you might be required to go through or the assignments that you might be given. A key thing that you want is to understand who your, as you said, supervisor or chair or committee member might be, who's supposed to be guiding you through that process. And ideally, what you want in this particular case is what I would refer to as a functional relationship with your supervisor, meaning what you want to do is take advantage of their expertise and their experience without becoming dependent on you impressing them. So something that tends to happen very often with people is that obviously they find themselves in this situation where they're in this enlightened space, as it were, and they're engaged in a degree that they've always wanted to be engaged in, and the prospect of one day having a PhD is starting to get excited, and you think that the person beside you is supposed to be sharing in your excitement and your empathy and what have you. This is putting aside the fact that they've probably done this countless times. They've seen countless students who all turn up with the same levels of energy and the same levels of enthusiasm every single time, only for that energy and enthusiasm to be shattered when they realize how hard this can be. That's that same experience. So you can kind of don't blame them entirely when they look a little bit tired at your enthusiasm. But nevertheless, what I'm saying is that what you're looking for here is not for them to agree with you on every fact. You don't necessarily need them to enjoy the process to the degree that you are, or to necessarily even follow along with every single one of your arguments or find everything that you're saying compelling. Their job, on the other hand, is to make sure that what you're producing is academically viable. That's the primary concern, that it meets the minimum standard requirements of comprehensibility, and that ultimately your PhD is going to be your contribution to the field, but that does require their guidance. And you should be taking advantage of that, much like a Sherpa going up a mountain thousands and thousands of times, however many times in a day. They've done this many, many times before, so you don't expect them to be as excited as you when you reach the peak. But they certainly know what they're doing. So you want to take advantage of that experience, you want to take advantage of that expertise, and you want to take advantage of the guidance that they can give you, whether or not they're that enamored with the arguments that you're presenting, or that enamored with the topic that you're going through, or that excited by what you've been arguing for and you've been presenting to them the entire time. It's beside the point. The key concern is a functional relationship where you can make use of their experience and expertise and drive you towards the goal in the most effective and efficient way possible.
So true. I think very often what we see at Grad Coach is that students are arriving at our door for many reasons, but one of the reasons that they arrive at our door is because the relationship with their supervisor, their advisor, is not what they hoped for. It's not what it should be. It's broken down in some way. And that's a real shame. You know, it's so important to ensure that you are investing in that relationship from day one, and that you're not going to win you're not looking to win a popularity contest with your supervisor. What you're looking to do is to demonstrate to them that you're committed, that you're listening, that you're willing to learn from their expertise and their experience, and that you're in it for the long haul. You know, as you said, Dr. E, a lot of students, they start really, really enthusiastically, and then they lose enthusiasm as they go, and simultaneously that relationship with their supervisor really starts degrading. And so you want to just be sure that you're giving as much attention and love to investing in the relationship, at least as much as you are investing in your project. Your supervisor is there to guide you. You're not always going to agree with them, and maybe Dr. E, maybe you can shed some light on how students can approach those scenarios where, let's say, they're on opposite sides of the fence in terms of positions.
Well, look, I mean, I feel like, first of all, I feel a little bit attacked because I don't know why we're assuming I would have had this issue. I mean, it's not like I'm combative, generally speaking. I'm a really nice guy. No, I'm kidding. We know that that's exactly what happened. It's exactly what happened in the course of my PhD, which is fine. It's okay. These things happen. But look, I think in my case that there are a couple of changes and twists and turns in the course of the PhD that might actually end up being a little bit as you said, shedding a little bit of light on the issue and a little bit enlightening. In particular, one of the things that I always suggest people do is if your PhD program permits it, and this is why it's helpful to find out as much as you can about your PhD program ahead of time, that you might want to have some say in the selection of your supervisor or your committee members or your chairs, if that's something that they will allow you to do. So if you can look through the potential candidates and the potential people who are available to you, ideally what you're looking for is not necessarily somebody who's going to agree with everything that you say, as we said beforehand, not necessarily somebody who's going to pat you on the back every time you say something that you think is correct, but somebody who's going to hold you to making sure you meet the standards in every single case, which might not be somebody who agrees with your opinions, might not be somebody who's published the things that you that you like, but certainly somebody who has the robustness, the history, the experience, the expertise, the awareness, and the focus to be able to take you from point A to point B at the highest possible standards. And although that might mean that at times it's a little bit bumpy, and that might mean that at times you don't necessarily agree with one another, or at times that you find that there's points of frustration or tension, that doesn't necessarily have to be a problem in and of itself. Again, the more successful you are at meeting the requirements that they set, and the higher those requirements, the more likely it is that you're going to pass in any case. Look, I'll tell you a little side story just so you're aware of exactly how this works and how this worked, at least in my particular case. So that particular supervisor that was, whose dog I got really, really familiar with and found out whether or not he was guilty, that supervisor was somebody that I kept on for the period of those 4 years. And as much as I think I did ultimately end up benefiting from what it was that he was trying to get me to do, the truth of the matter is that eventually I asked for him to be changed for somebody else. I mean, it just got to the point where the relationship was no longer functional. Not that we didn't agree with each other, we certainly didn't. He thought his dog was guilty. I definitely didn't think his dog was guilty. He thought that certain animals were communicating with him. I don't think Dr. Dolittle was anything other than a movie. But that's beside the point. We got to a certain stage where it just wasn't a functional engagement. It wasn't a functional relationship anymore. And what that meant was that I was going to ask for somebody else to replace him. And I don't know if it's the same thing across the world or internationally, but certainly in the United Kingdom, I have two supervisors, who's your primary and your secondary. He happened to be my secondary supervisor, and I asked for him to be replaced. And interestingly enough, the person that replaced him was a person that I feel permanently indebted to. It was her decisions and her thoughts that ended up pushing the PhD forward and progressing it. But what's particularly interesting is that her first decision was the polar opposite of what I thought I wanted to do. The first thing she asked me to read were the things I was the most terrified of reading. The first assignments that she sent me to complete were the things that I never thought I'd be able to pull off. And the fact of the matter is that as far as we went through the process, her and I maintained a civilized disagreement about the interpretation of the subjects that we were working on. Now, don't get me wrong. She's wrong. I'm right. But that's not the point. The point is that she disagreed with the way I was interpreting the work. I disagreed with the way she was interpreting the work, but we both had a very, very deep, very profound mutual respect for the way that we approached the problem in the first place and the way we worked through that problem and developed our ideas and so on and so forth. So it's not so much that we had to come to the same conclusions. It's that our journeys and the way that we went about those journeys, the processes that we took were exactly what they needed to be to meet the academic standards and meet the academic requirements in order to pass the PhD. It never has to be the case that she was going to agree with everything I said, because the fact of the matter is that there are thousands of PhDs passing across the planet every single day. You're not going to agree with everything or everybody says. That's not the point. The point is whether or not they meet the necessary standards, and having the right supervisor there, at least in my particular case, she ended up fundamentally changing everything for me. We went from 4 years of talking about bonobo apes and dogs and dolphins to doing the kind of work I actually truly, I thought I was afraid to want to do. And she ended up pushing me into a direction that I never thought I'd be able to pull off. And it was precisely because of her that it ended up being as successful as it did. And to be honest with you, it was precisely because we disagreed as much as we did that I came away with the level of confidence that I did. Because it meant that not only could I hold my own in terms of meeting those academic requirements, as I said, but that I could maintain a conversation with somebody I have a deep amount of respect for, somebody who's already done this before, somebody who's published multiple times, an expert in the field, knows exactly what she's talking about, and that we could disagree with one another and yet maintain that level of respect and appreciation for each other's work, just really grounded me in what I was trying to do. So that it wasn't so much a question of forcing my opinion down people's throats and trying to convince everybody that I was right about everything, even though I'm right about everything, but that's not the point. But it wasn't so much that, as much as it was the appreciation of the academic process and the understanding that whatever it was I ended up producing was successful because it maintained that standard. not because the end conclusion or the end destination happened to be really pretty or enlightening. It's the way we got there, and having the right guide, having the right supervisor, having the right Sherpa to take you up that mountain, endlessly helpful.
I think it's useful for students to enter this whole endeavor with some expectation of at least a little bit of friction between them and their supervisor. And in a sense, it's almost required. Your supervisor is there to push you and to sculpt you and to per your example, per your story, they're there to really push you into the things that you least want to explore. There's a reason that you don't want to explore those things. And very often it's because these things are intimidating and seemingly off topic, et cetera, and a good supervisor will spot that, and they're going to create a tension between where you are and where you might like to be, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. And so it's useful to really just understand that a good amount of, or at least a little amount of respectful disagreement and constructive disagreement is completely normal, and it's healthy. As you said, it teaches you, it equips you with these skills to be able to really engage in a debate. And so that's a very, very useful thing to understand from the outset, because what can happen is that students feel attacked. They feel like, oh, my supervisor is just picking on me. They don't like me. Everything that I put forward isn't good enough. And yeah, there might be some cases where that is the case. There are certainly many, many grumpy people within the academic machine, and some of them must get some sort of thrill from giving students hell. But let's assume that that's not the case, and let's just assume that, well, the supervisor is acting in your best interest and is giving you a little bit of tension so that you can grow through that, so that you can push yourself to explore the things that you don't necessarily want. And so it's useful to really expect that from the outset. It's great if you always get along with your supervisor, and it's great if you always agree, but don't feel like it's some sort of personal attack if they happen to push against your grand ideas.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I'll say this one last thing, just because I think it's helpful for us to, one, tag it onto what we've already said, but two, to clarify the point a little bit further, because I don't want it to be the case that everybody goes into their PhD supervision meetings or their meetings with their committee members or chairs, or whoever it might happen to be, and start wondering to themselves whether or not they should just accept every demand that's given, that as absurd or as ridiculous as it might happen to be, it just happens to be the right thing to do, and that whatever your supervisor is telling you to do is absolutely the correct thing, and you have to follow their guidance no matter what. That is broadly the case. It's true. Generally speaking, that is the case. But as you intimated, there are going to be instances where your supervisor isn't necessarily the most helpful person on earth, and their dog really isn't guilty. Damn it. Like, I don't know why we're having this conversation. No, but the point is that can happen. And you might find yourself in a situation where you're on a wild goose chase, or you're being asked to chase ghosts that don't really exist, or you're writing papers that you don't think are closely related to the work that you intended to do, or you can't see the path between where you are, what your supervisor is advising you to do, and where you're trying to arrive. In all of these cases, the solution, as in most relationships, ironically enough, in all of these cases, the solution is often honest communication. If it's the case that you find yourself in a situation with a supervisor who happens to be challenging, who happens to be difficult, and you're absolutely convinced that it's not working for you for one reason or another, or as I said, you can't see the path from where you are to what they're telling you to where you're trying to arrive, there's no reason you couldn't just say this. There's absolutely no reason you couldn't just sit down with your committee members or your chair or your supervisor and say to them, hey, I'm not entirely sure of the process that we're going down, or I'm not entirely sure of the direction of travel that we decided to take, or maybe I'm feeling a little bit lost. Could you point out to me how we're supposed to go from point A to point B to point C? I mean, what we said a moment ago is still true. Ultimately, this is your degree, and Lord knows it can be expensive. It can be challenging. Lord knows it's time consuming. It's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of energy, a lot of focus from you. And the achievement should be your own. And you should be commended not just for taking it up, but succeeding in that process. But in so doing, you have to take a degree of ownership over that process, which means that you don't simply wholly submit yourself to the demands and the requirements of your supervisor and what have you. You certainly take their advice and their guidance, because they know what they're doing in a way that you don't. They've traveled this mountain in a way that you haven't, and they've made it to the peak on more occasions than you can possibly imagine at this stage. Nevertheless, And those instances where they're walking at a pace that you're not comfortable with, or they're going down a route that you don't think you can manage, there's absolutely nothing wrong with you turning to your Sherpa and it's like, hey, are you sure this is the right mountain? Like, are you sure we're going up the right peak in particular? Like, is this the path that we really want to go on? Because I just saw someone falling down the other side. I don't know if this is really clever right now. You can say that. And then if they know what they're doing, which most of them will, they should be able to be in a position to be able to say to you, well, look, this is what we're going to do, and this is what this path looks like, and this is how we get from here to there, and here's why we're doing what we're doing, and here's why this feels particularly challenging right now. And in fact, some of the better supervisors, not that I want to distinguish between them, maybe I want to distinguish between them, but nevertheless, some of the better supervisors will even point this out to you throughout the process. Like, I know you're having difficulties with this particular area, so maybe it's a good idea for you to read some of these things, which might feel like a bit of a distraction, but it will provide you the grounding that you need to be able to take on the next stage. As I said, the supervisor I ended up taking on once I got rid of the previous one and exchanged him for this other individual presented me with a kind of text I never thought I would have to read, and to be honest with you, was trying to avoid reading. And her response to me was, well, stop being such a wuss, take it on. You know you need this grounding. You kind of build yourself into this and you can start to kind of get somewhere from this. And throughout the entire process, if you feel lost and if you feel confused, that's why you have a supervisor. So you can always just email me or send me a message or get in contact with me, or we can have a meeting. We can discuss the particular passage of the text that you're particularly confused by, or we can discuss the section of the book that you feel uncomfortable about reading, or we can discuss your confusions about the theories that you're getting into at this stage and how they apply to what it is that you're trying to produce. But do not relent. Her conviction was that if I grounded myself in those things, it would end up improving my work overall. And I can't tell you, I cannot overstate how right she was and how terrified I was at the time. I was absolutely convinced that maybe we were doing the wrong thing. But it was purely as a consequence of having an open, honest, respectful conversation with her, just saying, listen, I'm not sure this is what I want to do. And her saying, yes, it is. And here's why. That I ended up agreeing with her, and it worked out beautifully. I mean, I wouldn't be here telling you this otherwise, would I? I mean, it works out for everybody, right? We're all benefiting off of this, thanks to her.
Exactly. I guess the crux of it is this whole point in a nutshell is that your relationship with your supervisor is just like any other relationship, in that it requires work, it requires investment, and it really requires a high degree of communication and transparency. I think sometimes students are a little fearful of speaking frankly with their supervisor. I guess two sides of the spectrum. Some students are too timid and they're too scared to ask anything of their supervisor or potentially push back on them. And on the other hand, you've got students who feel like they're being personally attacked. And so it's always this hyper adversarial relationship. And of course, you want to avoid both of those, and you want to just focus on communicating clearly and treating it as you would any other important long-term relationship, which is what it is.
Absolutely, that long-term relationship. You are in for the long haul. This is, I mean, to go back to the Buddhism thing, this is the way they describe it. There's two analogies that I quite like from Buddhism, which is, look, you think about these things as work on work on work on work. There's no end goal here. It's just work until something happens. That's number one. But number two, the analogy that I always like to remind myself of is even with respect to enlightenment itself. So even going down a journey of spiritual enlightenment and doing all the things involved in that, the idea in Buddhism was, look, before enlightenment, you chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, you chop wood and carry water. Nothing really changed. The workload is the workload. It's just you being convinced that there was a really fun process in the middle of it. It's the same thing. You just got to keep up with that work.
There it is. Dr. E, it has been enlightening. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing a little bit of your experience with us.
Pleasure to be here with you guys. And Lord knows, if you want more, you know where to find me. I'll be right here.
All right, so that wraps up this episode of the Grad Coach Podcast. Remember, you can grab a free copy of our popular dissertation and thesis template over on the Grad Coach blog. You can find the link to that in the description. If you got value from this video, please do remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and you'll definitely want to check out this video next.